Mornbeal's Mercantile. It was the place for adventuring stock and obscure questing gear. Morn's was an overstuffed mess of ceiling-high, creaking shelving, leaning under the load of any product imaginable for the party who wants to leave prepared and return wealthy. There was no entry on any adventurer's list of necessary items he didn't have in stock. Leaning against a barrel of oil in the farthest corner, surrounded by sharp, pointy things and sharp-bladed things and heavy bludgeoning things, scribbling on a grimy notebook, eyes narrowed and brow furrowed, Margrim Bloodbane pored over his adventuring list, weighing his options for how much ammo he needed, for what weapons, for what murderous task he was going to take with him on his latest adventure.
So, if I'm going to be gone for a week, I'm gonna be killing 2, maybe 3 people a day. Then I need 1, 2, 3, as he counted on his fingers, times 7, plus, misses, plus, minus. Someone killing the bastards first. Carry the 1 and the 2 cards, bowstrings. I need 1 a day in case I'm all thumbs. So 7 plus a backup hand crossbow. Plus I have the bolts as arrows and quivers, and so heavy and bundled for travel, leather straps and quiver hoods.
The bell from the front door jingled as it opened and closed quickly, as if someone darted with a whoosh rather than walked in.
Hey, Morn.
Margrim knew that voice. He peeked around the end cap full of ranged weapons to squint through the dusty light of the aisle to see a familiar gnome skip to the counter.
"And hey to you, Twinkle Toes," Morn said with genuine glee. "What can I get you today?"
Well, I've decided to go on a little adventure.
Pointing at the display on the wall behind the counter, lit by small globs of magical light, she asked,
What kind of wands do you have up there for me?
Morn turned, grabbed the case, lifted it carefully off the wall, placed it on the counter in front of him, slowly unclasped the lock and opened the glass of the cover gently. The gnome raised herself up on her tippy toes and gasped in excitement at the collection of wands in front of her. The pulse of magic created a crackle in the air, and the whole shop suddenly smelled like a woodland field after an intense thunderstorm.
Oh, they're all so pretty. I'll be hunting nothing larger than an elk, but nothing as smart as us. But slippery. Very slippery. So I'll need something that won't miss.
This one, girl, a wand of magic missiles is good for hitting when you need it to, and it was made by a high-level wizard, I know. Plenty of charges, plenty of oomph over time, price is right, and I can get it recharged for half the cost of it new.
I don't know. Morn, what about that one?
She pointed to a black finger of wood streaked with bright blue lines.
Oh, well, that is a wand of lightning bolt. Very high level, not so many charges, but it'll kill a bugbear in one hit. It's more for murdering outright if you can hit with it.
Oh,
she said sadly.
Okay, I guess that one will do. You haven't been wrong so far.
She opined as she tapped her heels together and the wings on her boots puffed out a small cloud of twinkling powder like ground sapphires sparkling in sunlight. The gnome reached deep into a pouch on her belt, pulled out some platinum, traded it to Morn for the wand, spun around in a pirouette, thanked him, and shut out the door in a flash. Margrim slowly walked to the counter, 1 quiver of arrows and 1 bowstring in hand.
"Did you decide to cancel your trip?"
Morn asked.
"No, I think I've decided to go hunting rather than adventuring."
Morn started to close the lid on the wand case to clear the counter, but Margrim held out a hand and stopped him.
"Give me that wand of lightning bolts, and the best net you got back behind the counter. Pretty please."
Hello, welcome to Roleplay Geeks. I'm Frank.
I'm your token hippie, John.
I'm Jim, and I killed Steve-O. He's buried in the back.
And I represent Steve's both here and murdered.
As you may have surmised, Steve will not be joining us today. He has a prior commitment, and unfortunately...
And that commitment is death.
Well, he can't be here. Now, one of the results of this is that we had a topic in mind, but we really think it would be important for Steve to be here. So we're going to do what I'm going to call the bucket topic. We've got a bunch of little ideas. We have a sheet where we have ideas for talking about, for topics on the podcast. And there's basically, I think 80%, 90% of this comes out of Jimmy's mind. So it's a little warped topic list. But there's a ton of little things on there that together, I think if we put them into a bucket, come up with an interesting sort of side dynamic in gaming that needs a little more attention, or should have a little more attention.
Buckets.
So
I kicked the bucket. That's what I'm thinking. Steve-O kicked the bucket. Now we got to do a bucket topic.
So what we're talking about these little rules that are in most games in one form or fashion, and they mostly, to my eye, reflect a desire to model reality at some level. So we're going to talk about things like money. We're going to talk about things like long-term travel. We're going to talk about things like maintaining between sessions. We're going to talk about things like spell components, and we're going to talk about things like encumbrance. All these little rules that are usually within a game that, just don't exist in some of the stuff that we use as sort of a spiritual connection to gaming. So it's pretty, I don't ever really remember John McClane talking terribly much about encumbrance or money. It wasn't relevant to the action story that he was trying to tell. Yet these rules exist within our gaming system. So that's sort of the setup. It's a bit meandering. We'll see where we go with it. Hang on, let's get started. So let's start with the one that I feel like, I could be wrong, but I feel like gets ignored maybe the most, which is encumbrance. So
John McClane never carried more than like one gun at a time. I'm just
right,
saying.
and there was a story mechanism behind that, right? But I mean, the Marines, how many bullets did the Marines on Aliens have when they went on planet? Well,
they don't really know. I mean,
well,
no.
Yeah, they shot a lot of them though, so you
Right.
you can sort of guess. Well, okay, if they shot this many bullets, this many pounds per, many bullets per pound, then that's, good Lord, how were they moving?
That's the thing. Well, I mean, the one thing you saw was, there was a readout. There was a digital readout on top of the gun, as they were firing and stuff, like and it's like, and you see it, go down from 99 down to 80, down to 70, down to 30, and then I'm out, and there was, they use that in a way to kind of help bring the tension of, you got to switch out, and hopefully someone else is still shooting, and they're not going to get killed before they can get their next clip loaded and start shooting again. So, it provides the dynamic intensity, the suspense of the scene. And so that works really well, but you never really know that, do they have,
a cart behind them with... Yeah, a
They
cart
have,
behind them with
like,
just clips out the wazoo. They can just...
Right. Now, they did have the whole thing where, their lieutenant was like, everybody give me your ammo and stuff, he wanted I think the sergeant to get all the ammo so that no one started firing because the coolant lines for the reactor, there was a whole thing where they would all die if they, accidentally shot it, which they did,
they
of course.
accidentally shot it.
Well,
Exactly.
Okay, so let's not get too far down to, the recounting of a particular movie, but
Scene
the
by
point
scene.
is that almost every game that I can think of has some form of encumbrance, and it's really just an attempt to model how much that you as a character can reasonably carry, and it's usually a function of your strength or something like that at some level. But I don't know that we pay a whole heck of a lot of attention to it, really,
Right.
in our gaming.
Well, I will tell you this on the encumbrance side of things. The only time I really paid much attention to it was when I first started playing. When Frank and I first started playing. We did, what was it? It was that first module we did, Keep on the Borderlands.
Borderlands,
thing,
yeah.
And you got this little it's a bunch of caves on the side of a hill and a lot of interconnected little areas and stuff, and it's a bunch of different denizens of these caves that you have to wipe out and blah blah blah. So I remember going through and it was like, oh, you find this, and oh, you find this, and oh, you find this. And it's like, oh, and you were picking up like the good stuff, you know. Is this better than the sword I have? Oh, I'll leave it. I said, no, pick it up and take it. You can go and sell it when you get back to town. So I remember kind of looking at stuff, and you know, your character sheet had, you know, your strength and your attributes and stuff at the top, and a few little things, and then you were basically filling up the bottom of it with, you know, 22 swords, 13 bows, 400 arrows, you know, 3 casks of ale. I mean, it was ridiculous. You had this huge list of stuff, and I'm like, you know, this just makes no sense. This really makes no sense. And I remember then you also even had the, you know, how many copper pieces and electrum and gold and everything else. And I remember reading stuff, and it used to be that, I think it's changed now, but it was each coin 10 coins weighed 1 pound. And I remember sort of looking at that, and I'm like, you got 4,000, you know, gold pieces right now. That's 400 pounds you're trying to carry, along with 22 swords, 13 bows, 2 casks of ale.
I think we've all experienced the you know, the Monty Hall sort of style where you carry everything, and you can carry everything. And I think most experienced gamers have sort of a mental threshold where you say, well, that's just not reasonable. But, you know, I think the biggest problem is sheer volume of weapons a lot of times. Now, again, I hit Steven a lot for this because he's played a lot of varied games, but has Encumbrance played a big part in some of the other games that you've played?
Yes.
Could you go in depth in explaining exactly in what way? That was sort of implied by the question. If not, I will certainly treat it like a lawyer.
I was trying initially to speak more
hostile,
brevity, with more brevity. So hostile witness, and I'm a hostile host. So I want to go back real quick though first and clarify for people that John McClane is not the sports writer that comes up when you Google, nor is it Arnold Schwarzenegger talking about John McCain, but John McClane is a movie reference that maybe a lot of people don't know.
From a great, well, you know,
I mean, it's possible,
but a good Christmas movie.
Well, it's possible, but I mean, John McClane, the Die Hard movies are pretty well known, as are the Alien movies. So if you don't know it, then you know,
you would think
we can't explain every reference in depth. I mean, you expect your audience to keep up with you a little bit. Well,
maybe
the rest of us do. Steven thinks that everything needs to be explained ad nauseum.
Well, I used to think you wouldn't have to explain the Die Hard movies, and then I had this young millennial in my office who didn't get any of the references from that time period at all that I thought was like absurd. And then when I thought about it and started doing the math, I'm like, heck, this guy was, you know, like not even 10 years prior to his birth when this thing came out. So, okay, I sort of get it.
So
now.
That's a form of mental encumbrance that we carry. But
well, some of us, you don't carry it because you don't have any room left in your head to carry any more encumbrance.
I got a giant, big encumbered head. Thank you. So early on, encumbrance and that kind of character inventory tracking was super important. But as time goes on, I think that when people play, and they play in certain groups, that a little bit of that becomes more, you try to be realistic with your own character. So you know that if you are fully laden to go out on the adventure at first, you know, you're not going to be able to also carry X, Y, or Z that you come across. And you have to find a way to do that. So I think that the encumbrance rules and weight at least with the people I play with, there's an expectation of knowledge and maturity in the play where it's not as important and doesn't take up as much of the game. I think especially for beginning players, being aware of how much you're carrying and what you can carry is super important. Now, I believe that most people who are coming into gaming who have any kind of computer gaming background with role-playing games, anything from Fallout, Skyrim, Borderlands, anything, that they are intimately aware of the problems of encumbrance.
Yes, anyone coming from a computer gaming background, from Bethesda's great game to Bethesda's other great game to Bethesda's other great game.
Oh yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah,
yeah. There are other games that also feature that.
Yeah.
Steve has a predilection for particular, game engines. Yeah, I think that that raises the question of, does encumbrance enhance the game, do you think? Or is it just something you have to deal with? Now, I'm going to bounce this question specifically to Jimmy because my experience with him as a gamer, one, because he hasn't said anything, and two, because my experience with him as a gamer, with him as a GM, I don't think I've ever had you raise that issue. I mean, you almost always start with, what do you have on you? What are you taking with you? But that never seems to be tied to any level to encumbrance. It's always, what do you have access to for the situations that I'm putting you in?
Oh, it's always, encumbrance is always in the back of my mind as a game master. So the reason I ask what you have on you, first of all, you guys hardly ever take anything with you. So it's pretty easy. You've been punished enough by Steve-O and by me over the years that you generally just don't take much with you.
Well, the question is really, what do you want to lose in the next session?
Right.
Bad player.
So I
No
think
Gauss
about
rifle.
I think about it first.
Steven is the one that is the most Pollyanna about it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they won't take it all away from me. John and I are like, yeah, we're going to lose that. That's why we don't ask for any nice stuff, because it's going to be gone, so whatever.
Yeah, like in the last time we were doing
can
a
I have
Traveler.
a stick, please, sir?
Yeah, when we were setting up Traveler, Steven went through the Central Supply catalog and picked out a bunch of stuff. And I remember I was asking him about this, basically like a safety bubble, that if you're in an emergency situation in the vacuum of space, you'd have this bubble that would allow you to survive an additional amount of time. And I'll go and look for it because I'm like, that sounds like it'd be pretty large. And sure enough, it was pretty large.
But I was also
So we had
misreading it in the electronic documents we had, because I was looking at another thing that was very light, but it was essentially like a sack that goes over your head. And so, and I was reading the two things, and so yeah, that was a reading comprehension error.
Right. But so I think about it in two ways. The first way is the size of the object. So let's say you have something that's really light. Let's say you have one of those huge beach balls. You can't carry like 8 of those and expect to have them stay in good condition and be able to move. And, people could shoot them up and then you could carry a bunch of them because they'd be all flat and useless at that point. But the point being, if you have a really large gun and you start carrying 4 of them, the first problem you have is you got these huge things sticking all around you like you're a tiny little pin cushion with these huge pins in you. That's your first problem. And then the second problem becomes the weight. So I think about the weight second.
Wasn't that
usually.
like oh man, I'm trying to remember what movie it was. Like, I had like 2 guns coming off, like behind each shoulder, and a whole bunch of stuff all over it. It looked ridiculous. I mean, it kind of looked cool to an extent, but then you're like, man, that'd just be unwieldy.
But you guys don't break the rules.
Realistic,
I mean, and when I say rules, I mean you generally aren't ridiculous about the stuff you carry, and so I never have to bring it up. But with like younger kids that play, I usually don't bring it up with them either, because I take more of the video game approach. It's the equipment's less important than about telling the story and letting them be, the video game action hero. So I don't really worry about it much there either. But with sophisticated players like you guys, yeah, I do keep it in mind.
Sophisticated.
Well, Maybe not sophisticated, but
So, okay.
Seasoned?
seasoned. There you go.
So that kind of leads me to the question of, does encumbrance, you think, play a positive role from a gamer's point of view in gaming? Now, John had a point. He wanted to bring it up first.
Well, let me do a point real quick. Part of the reason that you've brought this up, Frank, that you kind of pointed out Jimmy, was generally Jimmy does Traveler, drink, or some other sci-fi based setup, where with you, I don't remember who else, or when we play like with Andrew, or some older stuff when we used to play a long time ago, where we did D&D. D&D really has more of that Monty Hall feel to it, where you're killing hordes, looting bodies, etc., versus when we are doing something with Traveler or some other kind of game that's sci-fi. You generally don't have quite as much, like gold. You're not carrying around gold. It's like it's a credit chip. You just grab this credit chip and, it's either like a credit card like thing or something like that. So it's very small, easy to carry. There's not much hoarding, as it were. I think that's where a lot of that comes into. That's a big difference anyway, sci-fi versus fantasy. I think you have the Monty Hall versus the, a million credits fits on my little, it's on my ring, on my credit chip on my ring. It doesn't take up any space,
So, okay, let's go to my question. Do you think, from a player's perspective, do you think encumbrance helps at all? Does it make any sort of positive? Or is it just a limitation that you have to deal with? So, for me, I'll say that I can't think of a single situation where... No, I take that back. I am going to take this back. For the most part, I hate tracking encumbrance. It's just a piece of spreadsheet accounting junk that I just don't want to be bothered with. But so in that sense, I hate encumbrance. It's annoying. And I also hate dealing with something we'll talk about in a minute that's somewhat related to encumbrance, where you have to basically keep track of things in a minute detail. But I will say that for me, it can create narrative potential if you think about what your character is. Now, it's unfortunate he's not here with us today, but in the last Call of Cthulhu campaign, we were going out to fight the big bad. We're going out into the woods. And 3 weapons that I had was I had a 911 45 caliber sidearm. It's a pistol. I had a M1 Garand or Garand, depending on how you say it. And it is a rifle that, proper looking rifle. And I also had a 45, Thompson 45, which is a submachine gun. And Steve-O did ask me several times, "You're going to take your submachine gun?" I said, "No, I'm not going to take the submachine gun." He said, "You sure you're not going to take the submachine gun?" And really he was offering me, because that's the thing I'm best at, but he was offering me a breadth of player potential for the weapons I had available to me. But I thought, it's kind of dumb to carry a rifle and a submachine gun and a pistol in a modern age. I mean, I can sort of understand taking a sidearm, and I can sort of understand taking one or the other. And we were going into the woods, and I thought, well, okay, I'd probably more likely to take a rifle if I was going into the woods as opposed to a submachine gun. So I did use encumbrance conceptually, even though I didn't do the math, to say, oh, no, this makes more sense for my character. So I think you can do that, but I think it's pretty rare. What do you guys think?
I have to agree. I think that the reality is it is like just spreadsheet. It's just like work. It's just like going to work instead. Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to be at work instead of playing a game with your friends? And so to keep track of the minutia of encumbrance, and I'll even kind of extend that to ammo and some of that other stuff, is kind of very similar, and it's tedious and annoying. Now, I think the only time that maybe it might need to be kind of watched out for is if you have, as a GM, you have a player who, is like, oh yeah, well, you guys need a rocket launcher to, be able to, fire it at this, airplane taking off. Oh, I've got one. What do you mean you got one? You got one back in your house? No, I've got it in my inventory. I have it with me right now.
So, what beyond that question to Steven, as a player, do you find encumbrance useful, or is it just an annoying thing you have to think about?
No, I think it's useful. I think you've got to think about it, and at some point the DM has to question what you are carrying. And in the beginning, it was easy to, try and say that you were carrying your whole house, and you needed a check and a balance for that kind of activity. So I think what you carry is very important. I kept track of that. Like Jimmy said, I've got that in my mind all the time when we play. Well, that's what I did when I was playing with the kids and running that game for them. They were picking up things along the way, whether it was wolf pups or, bits of shrubs and trees and weird plants. And every character had something that they were kind of stowing stuff away on this journey across this continent. And it needed to be, at some point they had to get a wagon, and they actually came up with that on their own. I didn't have to prompt them. So that was nice. And I actually give them credit for that because it added to the adventure of what they had to do with their stuff.
Well, I think from a GM's standpoint, encumbrance makes a lot of sense. But again, specifically, my question is, as Steven, as a player, do you find it, not the people that you're running as a GM, but as a player, do you find it advantageous or useful?
Yeah, I got to figure out a way to squirrel away stuff now and hide it from the,
the nasty
obligatory,
GM.
Yeah, the nasty GM, the obligatory prison trip, anything like that. So I've got my stuff separated between home base and what I wouldn't mind losing too terribly much.
I've been hiding your M1 Grand in my butt this whole time. Please, let's try to break out of prison. Yeah,
it doesn't need identity lock on it. I don't want to touch that.
So, what about you, Jimmy? Again, specifically from a player, not from a GM standpoint, do you find encumbrance? Is it what my sense I'm getting is that we're treating it all as a vague concept,
Well, for me, it's a little different because as a player, I'm usually informed by being a game master. So the way I think about it's a little different. It's not so much I'm worried about losing something because it's just a game to me. I'm more interested in what would happen if I can't carry something because of encumbrance, or, even if you get into things like ammo for crossbows. This is something that I really enjoyed with Fantasy Grounds with Andrew, is because all that stuff, encumbrance and the number of crossbow or bolts or arrows you have is all sort of maintained for you. So I have to be, what's really interesting is when I run out of points or for my monk abilities, it's very similar. Or I run out of crossbow bolts. I lose that option in combat. And that's really enjoyable for me as a player to start thinking about what do I do next? What different things do I explore as far as a player character goes, since this option's no longer available to me. So I look at it more from a game master standpoint of from a game master standpoint, I look at it and say, okay, they can't carry all this gear, or they've run out of their ammo. So what new and interesting thing can I do with that from a game master standpoint? And then I just carry that over into a player as well. So me as a player, I've run out of these options because of these rules. What kind of fun, interesting thing can I do now? Usually it's run away, but that's what I think about encumbrance and why I love it so much. It's a game mechanic you can put in that then leads to other more interesting, fun things.
I think that encumbrance works best as a vagary. You don't. I think if you're going to rules lawyer it and say, well, it says I can carry 120 pounds and I've got 118.7 pounds, type of level, it's an encumbering mechanic, if you will. It's a pain in the neck to keep track of and to GM. And I think that what you need to do as a player and as a GM is get to encumbrance as a reasonable line in the sand to say, well, is this reasonable? Is this not reasonable? And you can utilize that in a positive way. But if you try to do it, if you try to ignore it, it's not good. But if you try to over prescript it, it's also not very positive.
And I think the people who put the game together, Dungeons and Dragons specifically, they realized that. If you go back to first edition, they used gold pieces, like John was saying, 10 gold pieces equals 1 pound, and they converted every other thing over to gold pieces, so you would have that
a common weight.
A common weight to measure everything. And then they had hard rules about movement. If you had too much on you, you could only move half movement, and then quarter movement, and then you couldn't move at all. And they moved into second edition. They were a little bit more loosey-goosey with that, changed the rules up a little bit, gave you a little bit more leeway. And now with 5e, I think they finally got a really
and then
good...
in third edition, they decided that multivariate calculus is the most effective way to do anything. And so if you have differential equations, you can figure out your actual encumbrance. And it's a diminishing factor so it's not just these hard steps. That what happens is that if you can get three variable analysis that you
sure.
And now we're in 5e.
And then 5e,
fourth edition, it was just everything was a deck of cards.
So right?
I just throw away 4e, but I just figured they didn't know how to count and went from 3 to 5.
That's right. It's like the like Windows and went Windows 8, 10. Just skip that.
Right. So 5e, they did something really interesting where they just tied it to your strength, 15 times your strength. And then that was the most you could carry. And for most characters, I mean, you can carry that amount of weight with no problem, and you don't really have to think about it. And honestly, I don't think most people think about it. I think they approach it more like we do, a more loosey-goosey way. And they'll be like, there's no way you can carry 3 large statues and all of your gear through a dungeon. Come on.
Right. Well, the other aspect to that's really kind of odd is you have these thresholds. So you have, when you get over 120 pounds, for your strength or whatever, when you get over 120 pounds, your movement drops to half. So it's like, well, I'm moving fine right now, but if I pick up that wineskin, then
one
just suddenly
itty-bitty wafer, one little bitty wafer.
Right. If I pick up that that quarter off the ground, immediately I drop to half movement speed. I mean, all that's ridiculous.
Well,
So
I mean,
for
from
me-
a realism standpoint, but from a game mechanic standpoint, it's just a check to throw in there to say, all right, you're carrying too much crap, dude. Come
Right.
on, drop some of it.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing is, I'd rather have the idea of the game master just going, "How much have you got on you, dude?" And the player going, "Okay, sorry, I'll
I
drop
agree.
half this junk." There you go.
So, we've encumbered the conversation enough with encumbrance. Yes, there's going to be a lot of puns. I don't care. Get over it. And let's go into something that is closely related that Jimmy and John have both brought up already, which is ammo. All right. So
Well,
that's
I
a
just have to
little.
say really quick, Frank. It was a weighty subject. Sorry.
There you go. We carried it around a long time. All right.
did.
So now
I feel like I dropped a big heavy load off though.
I
There
don't
we
want to
go.
edit this one.
And let's move on to ammunition, which is related to encumbrance because the more you carry, the heavier that's going to be. That these things have weight, but ammunition is an interesting one for me because, all right, so Jimmy's already put himself in the ground and said, I like ammunition. It gives me limitations, and I like the narrative potential from limitations, which is great. That's certainly one point of view. Another is you could take it the other way, where you've got to keep track of, how many bullets you have, how many arrows you have. And I actually find ammunition to be more annoying to deal with, and I dislike it. And here's why. And this is a personality thing. Jimmy is much more risk embracing as a personality than I am. I'm much more risk adverse. And therefore, I find if I have to worry about the number of charges or ammunition or whatever it is, I tend to not do it because I always want to have some in reserve. And I find ammunition for me personally in the campaign that we're playing using Fantasy Grounds, for example, I tend to not use a weapon because I don't want to use up the ammunition because I don't know if we're going to get more. And it reminds me to use what Steven said of like a video game. I do in that sometimes in video games when you start off and you play a game, you just don't know how much ammunition you're going to get. Let me use things that I don't care as much about. And as you learn, oh, it's everywhere. Well, then, go nuts. So I have more problems with ammunition as a player than I do with Encumbrance.
Yeah, I have been thinking along the lines of, in my future games, I'm going to kind of ignore, well, mainly not so much ignore, but at least like in fantasy ones, ignore like arrow count and all that, because generally you shoot an arrow, there's actually a fairly good possibility that you will be able to retrieve your arrow. And if you're going to loot the body, well, you're going to be there anyway. So, and it's very likely you're going to be able to, recover your arrow. And then, maybe if it does need, maybe the head's pulled up away a little bit, you can just retie it. If you're an archer, you're going to have to have been somewhat of a fletcher to be able to create your own arrows or something. So, keeping your stock up for arrows or bolts, I think, would not be a big issue. Now, it's a different story with a pistol, new current or future fantasy setting. Then, you're just not going to be able to go, oh, there's the bullet. Let me put it right back in the casing here and ta-da, still
certainly with like an energy weapon,
right.
You can't get the energy back or anything.
Right. So yeah, but for fantasy ones, I don't think I really worry about it as much. So,
what about you, Steven? What's your thoughts on ammo?
Well, I think in the games that what?
I just wondered. I don't know if you hardly play anything that you use very much ammo.
Well, I don't use a lot of ammo, but I'm very cognizant of how much I have. So in
does it make you more or less risk averse, do you think?
Than I already am naturally?
Yeah.
More.
I don't think that's
absolutely
possible.
More. Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, think about it. I mean, we have these weapons in John's post-apocalyptic game. We have weapons in Steve's game. We have weapons in your game, Jimmy. And all of these, because they are, kind of realistic tech, we have bullets and there's a limited supply and they actually weigh and you got to figure out how you're going to carry them. I carry pockets full of shotgun shells in the Cthulhu game. And so I am, I'm judicious with how I dole out my lead.
Very, very prettily said.
I will say that I appreciate ammunition as a narrative potential. So in a past podcast, maybe the last one that was out, that Steve-O mentioned that one of the ways that you can constrain a bit of use of a super weapon or magic in fantasy settings. I mean, in science fiction settings is, you have an ancient weapon, but the way you do that is you have so many charges or so many bullets or whatever it may be. And I think that ammunition can serve a really interesting and powerful narrative potential. You can imagine a campaign, no matter what the setting, of where you're running away from something, you're being chased and you're trying to, conserve ammo, yet keep the pursuers off of you. And that can create a narrative potential. If you look at a lot of what was going on with the show like The Walking Dead, then, there's a lot of narratives that they're drawing from limited amount of ammunition. So I can see the power there, but I find ammunition to be an encumbrance on what I can do as a player more than anything else. And I don't like tracking it. I like keeping knowing about it. I want to do the thing I want to do and not worry about that minutia personally.
Dole out my lead. I'm still stuck on that.
Clearly.
Like a new novel by Stephen Mara, Dole Out My Lead. I can't decide whether it's an adventure, whether it's an adventure novel or an erotic romance novel.
Why not both?
Why not
It makes me
both?
think of Dolomite, which is an older reference that, according to the new rules that Steve's laid down, I have to now link to the Wikipedia entry of Dolomite. But just look it up.
It's not just a rock.
Ah.
I have a scar on top of my head because of Dolomite. And we'll save that story for another day.
You know what I've never used? Getting back to the topic at hand, if I can.
I don't think you can. I'm contemplating just sort of pausing it until you collect yourself.
Have you guys ever really used any of the spell components?
Well, yeah, that's
other than
that's
silence.
There's another one that I think we can talk about related to this. Is that I have never ever used spell components, and I'm pretty sure that if somebody were to go, "Well, do you have the spell components for that?" I'd go, "Oh yeah, those things." Like I totally forget they exist. And some of the spells are, the more powerful. They have some really weird spell components, and that's, I guess, my reason I don't use that is I know where I know where to buy bullets from. I know where to buy arrows from. I know where to, buy bags to carry things from. Where am I going to get these really weird components that doesn't require me doing like 10 levels of adventuring to find the eye of a red dragon or whatever that's necessary? So I don't use them at all. And I think that if somebody were to make me use them, I'd just say, I'm just going to be a fighter.
Yeah, I think for simple spells, I would never use them as a game master. It's just annoying, quite frankly. I don't know why I see it differently than like ammo. Maybe because you have to have all these different spell components, like a bat wing and a frog tail, and whatever.
Yeah, because you
Do
have to
frogs
bring
tails?
a wagon behind you. Like, okay, how many spells do you have in your book? Okay, well, you're going to need 4.5 tons of crap.
Yeah. Literally, bat guano is one of the spell components that you got to have, for whatever it is you need bat guano for. I forget, is it fireball?
I don't know.
I believe.
But I do know that Steve made this sound, so he has thoughts on this. So.
But I did want to make one more
Oh.
point before I
Okay.
jump off. But I would use it for those big spells, like the huge spells at the end, like Resurrection or something like that. I would make them go out of their way because it
Yeah,
puts
that, like,
more
a pearl.
onus on them to make sure that they have. You don't want them just to willy-nilly cast some of those huge spells that could be game-breaking if they could cast it every 5 minutes. So
like the way one thing I want to point out is that when I watched the cartoon Dungeons and Dragons, if you notice, none of those kids ever carried around, a sack full of components or
Anything.
Well, I mean,
Food.
the nerdy kid had, his hat basically. It pulled magic out of his hat is kind of how his worked.
it was such an accurate representation of Dungeons and Dragons too.
It was exceptional in that. And of course, in the one kid had the bow.
You
his
say
ranger.
you say that, but that bow is my favorite
It
bow
is. It
magic
is
item
awesome.
ever. Like ever. If any magic item ever. If I had that, that would be my favorite character that I would fight to keep alive.
Because you got a bow and you don't need ammo for it. It's just shoot. There you go. You're done. You can shoot as much as you want to. And there's no ramifications. So, but that is one thing that I wanted to do in my game system was to completely get rid of the need for components, but it would enhance. You can enhance your spells if you use them. So, with the idea that if you
So they're like spices.
kind of
Like you can make a beans, but
Right.
you spice it up. Now you got yourself a stew going.
right, exactly. You had a ham hock, you got a stew.
There you go.
You could basically have, you could cast a particular spell, but it would cost a certain amount of mana to cast that. But on the other hand, if you had some component that would be, beneficial for that kind of spell, then the mana requirement might be half that. Or you could even say maybe you can cast it fast, or any number of things. So
Okay, so Steven, you're
No. Yeah. So.
ahem.
So ragweed is out, and pollen counts are high. So you're welcome. Let's edit that out, please. So yeah,
You're editing it.
okay. I hated spell components when they got complicated. So it seemed like something that was kind of neat to do, to have your little things here and there for your spells, but as the game got bigger and spells got more complicated, the spell components became tedious. So in Dungeons and Dragons, they came out with a feat that allowed you to forget about your spell components, your basic spell components, and it freed you up. So basically every wizard had when they were able to get that feat, they got that feat. So it became a weird thing in the game where they had this restriction and mechanic that you had to use, and then once you got to a certain level, everyone was guaranteed to take this one thing to make it so that they didn't have to do it anymore. So if it's a matter of having spell components or not, I honestly don't think in a modern magic system that spell components would work in the same way. I think of spell components being something that you would use in something like a transmutation spell. So in alchemy, where you would need an actual substance for a substance. But when you're dealing with something that's a manipulation of energy or thought, things like that, I don't think that there should be spell components. But we're basing this on magic systems that are a combination of what was written in literature and old folk traditions, which usually had some kind of physical component. Hair, an apple, pens, whether you're dealing with voodoo or you're dealing with European witchcraft, all of these things had some kind of material component to them, but it does get tedious. I don't like it as a character having to mess with it, and that is why becoming a druid or a cleric and having a focus instead of having to track down all that stuff matters more to me.
Yeah, I say that spell components, I've always felt like, every rule has sort of a duality to it, right? One is the actual mechanics of the game. How do you play the game? The other is, how do those mechanics mimic, and it's weird to say this, real life, right? So the thing is that when we're talking about encumbrance, the idea that you have this, suddenly you're half movement, that is tied to a mechanic. And one of the things I dislike about spell components is I'd never felt like almost any other character class had that kind of mechanic that they had to deal with. So it was like an extra thing that is a restriction on magic users. And the second part about this for me is that my favorite magic system, without a doubt, bar none, in anything I've ever read, is from a series by David Eddings called The Belgorad. I'm not going to Wikipedia link it, look it up. But the general idea behind that is that if you think it, you could do it. And it's probably not radically different than psionics if you think about it at some level. But so the idea of mana that John's talking about, or that basic spell thing, is it's something that comes from internally. The Force is in Star Wars. Another great example of this is that you're manipulating an energy, and that's how you're creating your magic. And so the notion of spell components kind of doesn't fit in that physics. I hate to use that term, but physics of spell making. And that's one of the reasons. The other reason that I object to spell components, both in game mechanic sense and also in terms of mimicking the real world, And I realize it's ridiculous of making that argument when we're talking about Magic, but those things have always struck me as wrong. So I hate them, and I don't want them, and I don't have any interest in them.
I think as a game master, they're very useful to have, like I was saying before. And maybe this, one implementation of it is casting as a spell versus casting as a ritual. So those really high-end spells, I know Find Familiars when I really first started thinking about it, because you can cast that as a ritual, and it requires you to collect a lot of different things and spend some time setting them up and then casting the spell to find your familiar. But I generally don't like that, because I like to just be able to get my familiar back after a battle's done or after I've had a long rest in Dungeons and Dragons specifically. But those high-end spells like Wish or Resurrection, those ones that move entire worlds or create flying citadels or whatever else it might be, I think it's really good to have some game mechanic that feeds into the narrative that allows you to constrain the players from just willy-nilly going around and casting Wish every 5 minutes. And so I like that they have something in there that allows a game master to point to a rule and say, hey, you can't do this. And if there's not a rule in the system, I think it's important for a house rule to be designed just to constrain ridiculous outcomes that are game-breaking. At least that's my 2 cents. But I'm with you guys completely on everyday spells. I don't want to sit there and have to see if I have the right amount of spell components to cast Magic Missile every time I'm casting it.
Okay, so let's jump to another bit of minutia in gaming, which is maintenance. All right, so that's not true. I'm gonna back off of saying that. A lot of game systems, D&D has rules for maintaining things, stuff that you have to do oftentimes between sessions, but keep your stuff going. I know Jimmy's looking at me. You can't see this because it's a podcast. So Jimmy's looking at me like, what are you talking about? I don't know any rules like that, but it's actually in the DM guide. And again, it's a minutia rule. It came out of first edition and it's now optional rule stuff, but to me, that's a set of rules that are just dumb. I mean, this is a great example of rules that I don't think really add anything to the game. They exist primarily, from what I can tell, as a money sink, as a way to sort of drain money off of the players. And that's really, to my mind, it's an artifact of giving them too much to start with. Yes. If you don't give... money's not a problem if you don't give too much of it, and that's a whole different topic.
I want to put this out there because there are people who enjoy that. Like there's this video game called EVE Online. It's a redesign of Microsoft Excel, but they use spaceships instead. And essentially, it's like a large accounting game that is, for me, devoid of all fun. But if you're into accounting and you like crunching numbers in an Excel spreadsheet that looks like a bunch of spaceships, it's your jam. So I think maybe there are a group of players out there who enjoy those number crunching between sessions even. Maybe it's a way for them to spend time on the game when not everyone's around and they can crunch those numbers and then bring it to the next session and say, okay, in between these sessions, I made sure my armor was good. I wasn't able to do this or that because I didn't have enough money to repair it, blah, blah, blah. So there might be a group of people out there, like I said, who like that kind of gameplay. I'm not even aware of the rules for that specific thing.
But, go ahead, Steve.
You're talking resource management. You're talking a Sim City, a Tropico, something like that, right? More than gathering spell components.
I think Frank's yes,
Jimmy was nodding, by the way.
Yeah. I think Frank is correct. That's what Frank's saying.
Well, even Traveler Drink has those rules in them, right? I mean, there's a whole subsection of rules about not necessarily maintaining your gun, but there's all the money you have to spend to maintain a ship, for example, or a vehicle or anything like that. They're all in there. So this idea of maintenance is built into a lot of rules sets. Maybe not all. I don't know that Call of Cthulhu has anything like that. But the interesting thing, where I think that they can be interesting, is Traveler. Drink is a great example of that, because the maintenance of a ship provides narrative material, that, you've got to keep this hunk of junk flying, and that requires you to take risks to get jobs or to get income to do that. And so it can have a role, but it also is annoying.
Yeah, I do use it for spaceships and Traveler for sure, as a narrative and impetus for, going off on different adventures.
You don't have enough fuel to get to that system,
or like in John's case, his character has a incomplete, non-working set of power armor, and he has incentive, because power armor is rare and powerful, to go out and find these components. So he gets a really nice set of armor, which will make him a significant threat in most combat situations. So yeah, I guess I do use it in some cases, but not for like really simple things like your assault rifle needs to be maintained in between every adventure. I figure you're a Marines, you're taking care of that stuff just out of habit. And the materials to do so is pretty common. But big things like spaceships or power armor, sure. Anything that has narrative potential.
Okay, so what else can we add in the bucket? What other little rules have we missed that we could throw in to talk about?
Let me check my list here.
Eating, drinking, pooping.
Little rules for traveling distances. We thought maybe that would be something that.
Well, I was thinking about that, and I kind of backed off on including that, because I think that that's a greater episode. I think we could talk a little bit more about that, because it can, it has a narrative potential to turn into a much bigger thing if you want. But I kind of feel like travel, either it's a significant portion of the adventure or it's magic. You're just, okay, well, it's 3 months later and you're in this town that's in the south of the coast or whatever. It's not really relevant to the adventure. And I think if we talk about it as a narrative potential, random encounters and stuff like that, there's a greater topic. So let's bounce off of that. But John mentioned one just before you mentioned that. Another sort of bucket thing, which is eating and drinking. That sort of sustenance. And there are rules for that, how much you have to eat in a day. And I kind of feel like that's yet another one of those, has narrative potential, but other than that, a pain in the neck.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever really put anything in as a game master to have to, well, you guys got to eat.
Well, other than our cans of pudding.
I mean, like, right. Now that was your guys. I didn't put that in. You guys went on and on about that. But it was one of those. I mean, actually, like for the post-apocalyptic one, that was actually a really good one for that, because in any sort of thing like that, you just can't. Resources are scarce. Right. You don't know if you can even get clean drinking water. You don't know if your food that you might be getting is irradiated or.
After weeks
toxic.
of eating rabbits that have 3 eyes and berries that glow. That tapioca pudding was spectacular.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, for certain things, it does have a narrative component that really can bring it out. In general, though, like a science fiction one, you just kind of go with the assumption that just food is plentiful and everywhere. You have tons of it everywhere, just available, no matter what.
The replicator, as it were, just
right. Something like that.
Our corgi is very sick, and I'm going to go. I'll talk to y'all later.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, dude. Hope he's feeling better. Bye.
Okay, so
and then there were 3.
Right. All right. So, we've hit a number of minor rules that are in a lot of gaming systems, and we could go on about food. Trust me, this group can always go on about food. But as a whole, I think that I think the takeaway from the conversation is that I think you have to think about the narrative potential for these little rules, whether it be encumbrance or ammunition or food or what have you. And do they add or do they detract? And as a whole, we want to pick rules that add to the experience to make it more fun. Putting constraints on things can add fun, but it also can add a lot of headache, and that's sort of a careful thing. I believe most of the rules that we've talked about, except for maybe Encumbrance, I'm not sure, the majority of the rules that we've talked about now exist more or less in an optional sense in most of the gaming systems. If you go to 1E of AD&D, then it was everywhere, like every damn thing. It was a rule for everything. That's been streamlined, and I think that a lot of games have followed in a similar fashion. So, think a little bit about whether you want to include these things into your gaming systems, and where they provide you the capability to tell interesting stories, and where that they are just a pain in the neck that players don't want to deal with because they don't do anything for them. If you have any thoughts about any of this stuff, you can hit us up in the contact information coming along in a second.
Put it.
That's all we have for this week. Thanks for spending time with us. Please leave a review and comments wherever you listen. It helps others find the show. If you have topic suggestions or would like to get in touch, you can reach us at roleplaygeeks@roleplaygeeks.com. Head on over to the website for an archive of all our previous shows, as well as links to all our social media channels. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next week.